Dr. Michael Mei.
So, hey everybody, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael, and my talk is called The Roots of Music Perception. So, in the past decade, science has become very interested about the possible origins of the way we perceive music, and over the next few minutes I'll try to shed some insight on this issue through both my personal experience and also experiments that have been done in this area. So I'd like to start with the paradox of sorts, and that's that the fact that music exists within every culture lends validity to the fact that there's an extensive genetic basis for music. But yet the fact that it's so different from culture to culture suggests that much of it is also cultural construction. So most people take for granted that we're programmed to perceive certain sounds as associated with certain emotions. For example, major is usually associated with positive emotions, minor with negative, and people think that because so many different cultures share that same arrangement. Western people, for example, can usually tell if music from other cultures is happy or sad, even though they've never heard that music before, they're not familiar with those cultures. And even stranger people from cultures that are not familiar with the West, such as the Mafa people of Cameroon, can actually determine the mood of Western music. So, given these kind of universal parallels, we might be compelled to assume that there's some sort of universal manual for interpreting the emotional content of music. But I think that might be an oversimplification, because there are certain cultures that use major to represent sadness and minor to represent happiness, actually. For example, the composer Frederick Chopin was fascinated by these Ukrainian farmers who sang in the fields when they were happy, and they sang in the minor key. And Slavic and Spanish music also occasionally does this too. So I'm not sure why that is, and I don't think anybody's sure why that is, but my guess would be that certain cultures have had experiences with adversity that have led them to more bitter interpretations of happiness or joy, and that appears in their music. So although I do agree that certain combinations of frequency in music have inherently attached themselves to human emotions, it seems that those attachments are weak enough to be overridden occasionally by cultural conventions. So there is a reason for the innate qualities of major and minor keys, and there's a neuroscientist at Duke called Daniel Bowling who did an experiment and discovered that musical patterns actually mirror speech patterns. How so? So the frequency ratios in major, Bowling discovered, are actually, they resemble those of happy speech, and the frequency ratios in minor resemble those of subdued speech. So Bowling says that there may be this fundamental link between music and language, which itself is dependent on a fairly universal set of human emotions. Lastly, there's another group of experimental subjects which I think is very valuable, and that's human infants. And they're valuable because any musical preferences that they have usually aren't a result of cultural conditioning. They're usually innate, or we can assume that those musical propensities are innate. And in general, babies are fascinated with the music. They prefer consonance over dissonance, and they can grasp the concept of rhythm. So this proves that at birth, we already have basic musical capacities, and that our subsequent upbringing refines or even reverses those early capacities. So in order to expand on this notion of the innate components of musical perception, I'm going to turn to a historical case study, which I think is very interesting. In 2012, scientists who were excavating a Neanderthal campsite in Slovenia uncovered the oldest instrument ever found, and that is dated at around 50,000 years old. And that's a picture of the flute right there. On that instrument, the distance between the second and third holes, those are the two holes in the center, the distance between the second and the third holes is twice the distance between the third and the fourth holes. And this may not mean that much at first, but that arrangement, fashioned 50 millennia ago, is consistent with our diatonic scale today, which is the system of music that we currently use. And other flutes that were found in China around 10,000 years ago also make it relatively easy to play that same scale. So clearly we have a preference for certain ratios of sound, and those preferences have actually been constant over much of our human history. So therefore, the arrangement of our current scale must appeal powerfully to some innate mechanism. It must be the optimal arrangement and not just an accident. So, of course, there's a fundamental question that arises here, and that's why. Why do we prefer certain ratios over others? I think Bowling partially answered this question through his studies between the link of music and the link and speech. And I hope to expand on this further. So I have a kind of May's theory right here. This is named after me. And here's Michael's personal hypothesis. There are certain sounds in our natural environment. For example, bird songs, laughter, the movement of water, that signal the presence of resources, safety, or pleasurable experiences. A very, very long time ago in early human history, it was evolutionarily beneficial to respond to these sounds favorably, because in doing so, we'd be awarded with a better chance of survival. So the ratios present in those sounds became associated with happiness as an evolutionary incentive. And as human cognition developed, those sounds found themselves embodied in the ratio of the major scale. So on the other hand, sound signaling danger, such as the chromatic nature of the howling of wolves or the call of predatory animals, influence our minor and diminished intervals more. So I think this would explain the biological programming of our certain musical preferences very well. But as I said earlier, in practice, nothing is set in stone. Those preferences may be overridden by cultural factors occasionally. So this is just a short digression showing the frequency ratios in our current scale. And I think this is something very beautiful and unknowable, how a major third is characterized by a 1.25 exact frequency ratio, and a perfect fifth is a 1.5 exact. And why there are these whole numbers and why they appeal to us so much, I don't think anybody knows. And I think this is one of the most beautiful things in music and one of the most mysterious. So just as a conclusion, I think it's very important to consider the present-day artistic implications of our changing music perception, because every decade, our culture invents new musical structures while simplifying, marginalizing, and even forgetting old musical structures. So for example, today, Western music is subtly but surely moving towards this lopsided gravitation towards a major key. And my question is, will that gravitation hinder the artistic expression of nuances that used to be associated with the minor key? I don't think that's an easy question to answer. I don't think there's a concrete answer to that question, but I think that if we want to understand how we're enabling and limiting ourselves artistically over the years, it's definitely something that we should ponder. So here's my final appeal to the artistic community. So whether you wish to diverge from musical tradition or build on musical tradition, I think our awareness of the mechanisms of our perception is absolutely essential to a fulfilling artistic experience. Thank you.